Thanks for coming. I'm going to provide some information about the National Historic Preservation Act and how we comply with that act at the NNSS. I want to thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Historic Preservation Act. I'm going to provide some key definitions. There is criteria that needs to be met in order for sites to be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. We're going to talk a little bit about the Section 106 process, which is actually the process that you have to go through to be in compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. And then we're going to look at some photos and discuss a little bit the types of historic sites that we have at the NNSS. So the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted in 1966. It was intended to preserve historic and archaeological resources in the United States. Congress basically recognized that many of our historical resources that are key to our national heritage were being destroyed, sometimes inadvertently, but they were still being destroyed and lost, so future generations wouldn't have the information that you can gain from those resources. The Act also created the National Register of Historic Places, which is the official list of districts, sites, properties that are deemed worthy of significance. The National Historic Landmarks, which are basically the sites that are eligible for preservation. So of the over 85,000 sites that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, only about 2,500 of them are actually considered national landmarks. The process to get sites listed on the register and designated as National Historic Landmarks is extremely long and expensive. The Act also requires that we consult with the State Historic Preservation Office and tribes. So I'm going to skip back to the third bullet there, Section 106. As I said before, is the process to comply with the law. And that's mainly what the focus is going to be for this presentation. And basically, Section 106 requires federal agencies to account for the effects of undertakings on historic properties. So the first definition we need to know is, what is an undertaking? Basically, an undertaking is any action, project, program, activity that has some type of federal tie. So it could be federal funding, it could be on federal lands, it could require federal permits or licenses. So because we are the NNSA, a federal government, almost any action, well, all actions that we conduct at the NNSS must consider the effects on historic properties. So what is a historic property? It's any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included in or eligible for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. With most regulations, there are criteria that must be met in order to deem properties eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. There are 4 primary criteria. The first one, A, is the properties have to be associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. So, nuclear testing at the NNSS would fall into category A. B, that are associated with the lives of significant persons in our past. So maybe Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., where President Lincoln was assassinated. C is that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master that possess high artistic values or that represent a significant distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. That's a lot of words to basically say cool and distinct, unique architecture. And actually we have some examples of that on the NNSS. CP1, which we'll talk about later, is one of those properties, as is the Mercury Bowling Alley. And then criteria D is that they have yielded or may yield important information about our past. So those could be archaeological sites, pictographs or rock rings, pots, where you can, items that you can deem information about past civilizations, how people lived, the tools they used, that type of thing. So now let's talk about the process. Section 106, the process is described in detail in 36 CFR 800 subpart B. I am not going to bore you with those details. Instead, I'm going to tell you how we implement that process at the NNSS. So basically, I'll walk you through what happens once a project is planned, and I will be notified that a project is going to take place. Under this process, we call it an undertaking, but it's basically a project or activity. I will notify the archaeologists that we have a project, and they will go out in the field and they'll survey the site and the area that they deem as the area of potential effect. At about the same time, we'll coordinate with the CGTO. We either do that through a spokesperson, who is Richard Arnold, or we will sometimes form subcommittees so that the tribal members can provide their perspective on the various resources in our activities. So if historic properties are identified during the surveys, a determination is made as to whether the proposed activity will cause an effect to those historic properties. Research is done, the site is evaluated to determine whether it meets the criteria that we just described, A through D, or it doesn't have to meet all of them, it can just meet one of them to be eligible. And if we determine that the activity will have an effect on the historic resource, often we will coordinate with the project folks and figure out ways to avoid the resource if possible. So they'll just move their drilling site slightly, or whatever measure is needed to avoid impact to that historic site. A cultural resources inventory report is prepared that documents the results of the surveys, all the research that was done, and it also states the results of their evaluations. Based on the findings, the NFO, usually me, I will make the determination as to whether the historic property will be affected by the project or activity, and also I'll make the determination as to whether the site meets the eligibility criteria for the listing on the National Register. As I said earlier, consultation with SHPO and the tribes is required by the Act. So I will submit the report to SHPO. They will have 30 days to review the document and issue, I will request that they concur with my determination of effect, no effect, and concur with my determination of eligibility for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, SHPO usually agrees with us, but not always. They often come back with questions. They can totally disagree, and so therefore we have to consult with them, coordinate, sometimes negotiate additional measures to mitigate the effects. So there are a variety of responses that we can get from SHPO. But ultimately, after consideration of their comments and the tribe's comments, it is the federal agencies, the federal agency has the authority to decide whether the project proceeds or not. So even if it may have an adverse effect on historic properties, we do have the right to proceed. So that was kind of the boring part of the project, of the presentation, I think. Now, I think the photos are going to be more interesting. We have the various types of sites we have, historic sites we have at the NNSS, include archaeological sites, as shown here, pictographs, rock rings, American Indian sacred sites, historic sites, and there are obviously a lot of significant sites associated with nuclear testing, such as this emplacement hole that's located on Yucca Flat, and the ship in the desert, which is a mobile diagnostic structure that was used during testing. Many debris piles. The Huron King, which I believe contained communication satellites, and they simulated space conditions, I think, during testing. This is one of the two Apple II houses. They constructed this wooden Apple II house, and then also a brick Apple II house, and some other structures to see how they would stand up to nuclear detonations. Both Apple II houses did withstand the blast. However, there were other structures that did not. These sites are all located on Frenchman Flat. They were testing various types of construction and also construction materials. This is a railroad trestle. And then this is an aluminum structure. They built I think it was 8 cement structures and 2 aluminum structures to, there again, test the type of structure and the materials to see how they'd withstand a nuclear test. And obviously, the aluminum structures didn't do so well. And then I think this is I believe this is a aircraft hangar. You're all probably familiar with Sedan Crater. It is the only site on the NNSS that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was listed in, I believe, March of 1994. So I mentioned CP1 earlier. This is what CP1 looks like now. It was the control center for during testing. It was basically where the go, no-go decisions were made. They monitored all kinds of various types of information during testing. So CP1, the undertaking is closure in place. The building's been vacant since December of 2015. There is no power to the building any longer. We conducted a Section 106 evaluation last year. It is eligible, and I need to look at my notes for the criteria that is met, that it meets. It is eligible to the National Register of Historic Places under Criteria A because it was critical in the development of the country's capability to perform nuclear testing in the continental U.S. It also meets Criteria C because its design and character-defining features are a unique example of brutalist Cold War architecture. Brutalist architecture is cement, basically. You see it all over a lot in Washington, D.C., federal buildings in Washington, D.C. And it also meets Criteria D because it was a focal point for how a building for nuclear testing was designed. So we evaluated CP1. We went in and took extensive photographs to document the building conditions. And the report was submitted to SHPO, and they are reviewing it now, so consultation is in progress. This was the control room in CP1 in 1965. This was the war room. You've probably heard or seen the war room. They monitor all kinds of testing activities. There were phone lines, communication lines, electronics. So those are the photos from 1970 and 1985. And this is what it looks like today. Pretty much the same. You can tell that the technology is improved. This is the observation gallery that overlooks the war room. During the days of testing, the media would be located in this area. Unfortunately, because the building has been vacated since December of 2015, most of the rooms look like this. They have been vacated and all the furniture removed. Another building that meets eligibility criteria is the bowling alley. Now pay attention, if you can see it I don't know if you can see it very well. I don't know what you would call these arches on the architecture. It's kind of a wavy roof there. That is a specific type of architecture that was important to that time period. So it will meet one of the criteria for eligibility. So the undertaking for the Mercury Bowling Alley is that there are plans to possibly demolish the building and construct a new office building. It's been vacated since the mid to late 90s. We did conduct a Section 106 evaluation last year. It was completed in July. It is eligible under Criteria A from a local level of significance. Basically, during testing, there were a lot of workers out there, and there was very little opportunity for socializing. Well, the bowling alley fulfilled that need. And a lot of people, a lot of ex-workers at the site have fond memories of activities that went on at the bowling alley, and almost every single one of them, without exception, mentioned that they had the best hamburgers in the state. So a lot of people thought it was an important building. And then it also meets is Criteria C, which is the architecture. Here again, SHPO consultation has been started. They have, they're reviewing the document right now, and they have actually come back with a few questions. So this is what the bowling alley looked like when it was open and functioning. Unfortunately, this is what it looks like now. It has experienced a lot of water damage, and it has not been maintained since the late 90s. So, to recap, the National Historic Preservation Act requires that we follow a process to determine what types of effects our federal agency's actions will have on historic properties. The intent is to preserve historical and archaeological sites. However, preserve may not mean what we all think it means on the surface. Preservation, defined in the regulations, is anything from identifying and evaluating the site to actually restoring and conserving the site. So, therefore, not all eligible sites are preserved, I shouldn't say preserved, are restored or kept. And it's important to recognize that the process requires consultation with tribes and SHPO, but after we consider their input, the federal agencies have the authority to move forward with the project even if it does adversely affect historic properties. Any questions now?
So if CP1 qualifies and if they decide to do whatever they're going to do with it, they're not going to do any restoration though, correct?
No. The plan for CP1 right now is to close in place. They basically have closed the doors. They've taken all power and utilities down. They are filling any cracks, holes that are there, and there's just nothing else is happening there. It's shuttered.
That's really a shame. They would spend a little bit of money.
Can you use your microphone, please?
Yeah. I said that's a shame if they would spend a little bit of money to at least partially restore the actual control room. That was a very impressive room when it was operational. It would be a good place for tours to go look at. The closest thing most people can relate to it is what they see on TV when they used to have a shuttle launch and they'd show the control rooms, because all the monitors going, and it was really a good looking sight to see. But you don't want to spend money, right?
Well, yeah, it's all about funding.
That's what I figured.
It may not be that we don't want to spend the money. It may be that we don't have the money to spend.
Well, that's a shame.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree.
I don't really understand why you'd put it on the Historical Act. It's just a concrete building from the outside. Big deal, you know. Same thing with the bowling alley. But it's not my decision.
Anything else?
My question goes along the same line. I'm perplexed about why they would, like he said, put them on the list and not do anything to maintain them, and in particularly maintaining. Something's got to be done. An example is the bowling alley. I mean, that thing is destroyed now, and it does have some architectural value, really does, 1950 style. So I suppose there's no envision in the future of ever opening any of these sites to visitors?
I don't know that.
Okay.
I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah.
We have photo documented both buildings so that in the future, if for whatever reason they are demolished, which is possible for the bowling alley, we'll at least have photo documentation of what it looked like in the past and what it looked like now, but I don't know whether they will ever be actually preserved.
Well, from my point, it's kind of dumb, but that's okay. I would like to see the control room not only maintained, but like others, I'd like to see it put back together and use the basis of people going out there and seeing what went on eventually. Now, what would be nice from you is maybe you can tell us what we can do to help that issue. If it's budget, then let's find a way to do it.
A lot of it is budget. There are funding sources, grants available. I am not sure what the requirements of those grants are.
Whose budget responsibility would this come under? DOE or who?
I really don't know. I would say DOE, but I don't know.
And nobody's ever made application or put up a fight or said anything about it?
Not to my knowledge. You have to keep in mind, I've only been here a year.
Okay,
So
I don't mean you.
I should have started with that, huh?
Well, now you know where we're going to come from.
Well, that's okay. I would appreciate any help that you can provide researching any type of potential financial assistance that we can get.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You as a private citizen may be able to qualify, or you as a group may be able to qualify for grants
Yeah,
to help preservation.
yeah,
But I don't know that.
okay. Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Does anybody else have any final questions for Carrie? Okay, all right. Thank you so much for your time and for
Thank you.
presenting.
Saving the bowling area.